here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's April 18th here in Seoul. I'm Shin-Yun, and you're watching News Generation. Joining me in the studio is Choi Ji-hee.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Jessica Dainong.
Happy Thursday, everyone.
Happy Thursday. Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Most doctors in South Korea are still involved in a standoff with officials and are refusing to return to hospitals in protest against the government's plan to expand medical school admission slots. That's why in a panel discussion at the Korean Medical Association's Global Forum Symposium on Tuesday, medical professionals were vocal about how the government has failed to listen to the opinion of medical experts when making healthcare policies. Executives from the World Medical Association who were present sided with doctors, saying medical experts should be involved in government policy making to ensure a good healthcare system. Water temperatures on South Korea's east coast are quickly climbing. According to the National Institute of Fisheries Science, temperatures on the east coast of the country increased at double speed compared to a decade ago. In fact, a recent report says the average Iceland speed, which refers to the speed at which warm seawater moves poleward in a wide sea area, has hit 49.5 kilometers per 10 years. Back in 2010, the figure stood at 20.8 kilometers per 10 years. And due to high inflation and rising living costs, South Korean households spent 24.5% less on private education fees in the first quarter of this year compared to the year 2023. That's according to BC Card, which found that most households removed their children from physical activity or arts academies. There was also an exodus of students from study academies that provide after-school review courses. Second language academies also saw sales drop by 42% on year. And Statistics Korea recently released a similar study. This data was based on household spending on private education in the fourth quarter of last year. At the time, it was found that while the top or upper income class of Koreans spent 25% more on private education than at the same time last year, those in the bottom two tiers of income spent roughly 20 to 50% compared to less than a year ago. Now, this shows that we're seeing polarization in private education spending, and this type of phenomenon may continue with prolonged inflation, which is exactly why I would like to ask our panelists what their thoughts are on this story.
You know, I think it's a very interesting study because with private education, it always sort of polarized and highlighted this income gap because quite obviously, if you have more spending power, you would allot a lot more to private education. So when it comes to inflation or situations like this, obviously people with lower income would take their money off of private education, meaning there's an increase in polarized in terms of educational opportunity. Now, I think this only highlights the already existing systematic problem when it comes to private education. And I do believe that if it isn't addressed properly and quickly, it is only going to become a higher hindrance to young couples wanting to have children because they have to have extra income to spend on private education.
Exactly, and the government is well aware that we spend a lot on private education, which is why last year they took away the killer questions and soon of the very difficult ones that require private education. But I do agree that there needs to be much more efforts than that. Now, Chi, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this news story definitely sheds light on the complex relationship between economic factors and educational access here in the country. Now, initially, I believe that the decrease in spending on private education was a positive change. However, it seems that this is not the case as lower income households have been significantly reducing their private education spending more than higher income families. Now, it's crucial to take proactive measures on the government side to address not only the challenges posed by rising living costs, but also the potential exacerbation of socioeconomic inequalities when it comes to education.
Exactly. As you mentioned, it's worth noting that while we may have seen sales of private education academies come down, there still might be a very deep polarization as to the top tier class in terms of societal income, having a lot more of their students go there compared to the lower income class. So hopefully we'll see less of a gap between these two classes. Now, switching gears to our main discussion topic of the day now. Another main concern that seems to be a never-ending task for our generation is securing a house or an apartment complex in South Korea. Reported a few times on how hard this is, given that Seoul is one of the most expensive cities in the world when it comes to housing. Nevertheless, being able to have a roof over your head is a key basic human right. So here in the studio, have you two succeeded in securing your own house in Seoul?
I don't know if I have succeeded, but I've definitely succeeded in having a roof over my head. I have been a renter since graduating from college and having lived in the highest metropolitan cities in New York and here in Seoul City, I've always had trouble finding an affordable housing. Even when I was living with my parents, they highlighted the importance of paying rent. So I kind of got used to the idea of paying rent. Now, one thing was when I was starting off as a young career woman, it was impossible for me to do any sort of jeonse, the full deposit, because when you're just starting out, you just don't have that much saving. So what you end up doing is either putting up high rental, prices to live in a safer neighborhood. Because as a single young female, I would rather pay a little bit more and have better access to transportation or security.
Exactly. Now, what about you, Ji?
Well, I've been living alone most of during my 20s and my early 30s as well. And just like Cheska, I'm living as a renter myself here in Seoul. But what's a little burdening is that the monthly rent that I used to pay back in graduate school, and I was living in the Gangbuk area, northern part of Seoul, it was a lot cheaper compared to where I'm living right now in Gangnam. But I can't give up on the transportation, how close it is to Arirang, and my other workplaces. So I can't say I've successfully secured a house for myself, but I do have a roof on top of my head, just like Cheska said, and I have a place to live in.
But I have to admit, I think you guys are relatively on the lucky scale when it comes to our generation, because living in Seoul is such an attractive option, but it's not that affordable. So how many millennials and Gen Z are able to afford housing, whether that be in Seoul or other regions nowadays?
Right, so if you take a look at the proportions, according to Statistics Korea, there are approximately 16 million MZ households here in the country. And among them, parental cohabitation households, or those living with their parents, make up the largest share, accounting for 42% of the total, which is totally understandable given the high living costs and housing costs. And the next largest group is couples with children, accounting for 19%. This followed by single-person households at 15%, and married couple households as well. Now, interestingly, the proportion of single-person households has increased in recent years. This is mainly due to a rise in unmarried individuals, of course, and those who are choosing to get married later in life.
Exactly. I am one of the 42% living with my parents. I mean, I would love to be independent here in Seoul, but it's just very costly with the salary that I get and the spending that I use. It's so hard to afford a house, whether that be monthly rent or even jeonse. Now, Cheska, would you like to add on as to how many young Koreans are able to afford their own place these days?
And exactly like you mentioned, and Jihi and I gave our testimonials, it is incredibly difficult to find a housing in Seoul City. So let's take a look at the screen to see how MZers here in Korea are actually living. So more than half of the MZers are actually doing rental, and then closely followed by jeonse, which is a full deposit that you put in and then you get it all back after your lease. And then about a little over 10% did own their house. And I think one of the reasons that we're seeing such high proportion of renters, as we mentioned, has to do, one, with the fact that your first salary or when you're first starting off, you wouldn't be able to sustain the living conditions of having to pay a full deposit. But I think the other reason is, as we have discussed here in News Gen, there has been a recent jeonse fraud that swept the nation. So I think now a lot of youngsters are turning to rental options, which obviously is a lot safer.
Exactly, and we've mentioned a few times on News Gen that jeonse fraud has actually pushed a lot of millennials and sometimes even Gen Z to go to the brinks of thinking of taking their own lives. This is a very severe problem here in Korea, and understanding that it's hard to change the reality of the circumstances we're living in, many young adults in the country have come up with creative ways to better find housing, and one of that way is co-living.
That's right.
So, Ji, why don't you first introduce what co-living is and how popular it is among the younger generation?
Sure. So co-living is really a new trend that's been gaining popularity, especially among professional workers. And this is mainly due to rental scams, like we mentioned, the jeonse frauds that we've been facing, which has made people more cautious about renting apartments on their own. So co-living is a type of accommodation where you have your individual bedroom and a bathroom, but common spaces such as the kitchen and the living room are shared among the residents. Now, for example, they're kind of like an upgraded version of boarding houses as well as go시wons that we commonly see here in the country. So it's like a dormitory style room, but then it's a lot more expensive compared to these koshwons and the boarding houses. And what's different is that these co-living spaces are often run by companies, and we're seeing an increase in number of these types of accommodations, especially in the most busiest urban areas within Seoul, such as Gangnam and Myeongdong.
And Ji, being a Seoulite for so many years now, have you ever experienced living in a co-living habitat?
I have, actually. I've been living in one of these co-living habitats or accommodations in Pangyo, which is known as the Silicon Valley of Korea. It's located south of Seoul. And I've been living there for a year, actually, last year. And in fact, it wasn't just the kitchen and the living room or the lounge that was shared. They also had an exercising room, a mini theater you could book.
That's so nice.
A working room and a printing room, a meeting room, and even a laundry room. And they even had a very hotel-like terrace with a sunbed as well. Not a sunbed, but sunbeds. And they were very pet-friendly as well because they have designated zones where you could walk your pets.
This sounds like a great idea because if you pay just the right amount, you're still, though you have to live with people that you may not know, you can get close to them while enjoying all those different types of services out there. Especially, it's really nice as a pet owner to hear that there's also pet-friendly options. Cheska, would you like to add on?
I like how it's like a designated pet-friendly area. Like this section is squared off for those with pet. But as Jihi mentioned, a lot of corporations are jumping into the co-living spaces, so much so that the government has actually decided to sponsor and make some legal types that if the corporation decide to build more of these co-living spaces, you can actually get even loans from the government. But one other thing that I would like to add about co-living is, although I have not had the opportunity to live like Jihi did, I visited a couple of my starter friends who actually do choose to live in this co-living. And one of the reasons that they gave me was, even though the living quarter itself is a lot smaller than having your normal rent, the common rooms serve a greater purpose. For instance, as Shihi mentioned, they do a lot of cookout, and even some places they even have social events related to career. So they have a co-living space specifically designated for software developers or artists, and you get to not only mingle with the people that you live with, but also network and build this kind of relationship, which I thought was quite creative.
And I do think that this type of trend was facilitated by our generation, but we have to admit that the government is always aware about all the different housing crisis situations out there, whether it be jeonse fraud or trying to make houses more affordable by lending a lot of people with more affordable options, or cheonyak. Now, is the government supporting latest policies, particularly in regards to cohabiting or any other affordable housing options for our generation?
Well, yes, there are several programs available by the government, such as the Happy Housing, which offers affordable housing options for newlyweds as well as university students aged between 19 and 39. And these options are located close to their workplaces and are offered at prices lower than the surrounding market rates. And another program called Youth Purchase Rental Housing purchases existing houses and then rents them out at a subsidized rate to stabilize the living conditions of low-income individuals in urban areas as well. And they also have the Youth jeonse rental system, where jeonse contracted housings are re-rented to the younger people at a lower price for them to be a lot more affordable.
Cheska, would you like to add on to that list?
Sure, and here in News Gen, we talked about several government support systems to youth, and definitely rental support system is one of them. But another thing is, if you are moving frequently, the government also sponsors youth who are on the move. And another thing that was interesting was these sponsorship comes with certain conditions, such as whether you own a house or if you meet a certain living standard. So if you do fall onto this criteria, you should definitely check it out. And as one of the youth living in the city, I do hope to see more of these programs available to sort of different types of income as well. Yeah, I think that would definitely help a lot.
Hopefully we'll see that. And it's great to hear that the government is on board with the fact that they are aware about the housing crisis among the youth here. Now, we asked our viewers to share their own unique or special youth housing support programs and policies in their respective countries. If you take a look at the screen, you can find out what 3 of them had to share with us. Let's Let's start with Slav. Slav says in the USA, it's mostly public housing. Subsidized housing, which takes 30% of your income for rent, subsidized by HUD, housing and urban development. Leon said Singapore's national pension scheme, CPF, allows members to utilize their savings for various housing purposes. These grants can be used for down payments or to offset the mortgage loan when buying public housing. There's also priority for married couples and young adults who are getting married that can apply for heavily subsidized public flats. Benny said, for me, since the Philippines has some programs that will give assistance to provide housing, that'll depend on the certain loans that the younger generation wants. And despite being well known for its relative wealth, the Netherlands is suffering a surprising housing crisis these days. The government has stimulated home ownership and left building to the market, where many have been priced out and cannot find an affordable house to buy or rent. And this has driven people to present a petition calling for affordable housing. That's why we're going to hear from a Gen Z living in the Netherlands to find out about the housing situation there and if there's any policies we in South Korea can blueprint off of. Let's now turn to Yellow Clip, a Gen Z living in the Netherlands. Welcome, Yellow.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
All right, Yellow, we've decided to connect to you because here in South Korea, we've been having a housing crisis for quite a long time now. And I was quite surprised to hear that even in the Netherlands, the situation is similar. Up to last year, I'm well aware that many signed petitions demanding the housing minister to come up with better support and subsidy programs. Why don't you walk us through the current situation there?
Yeah, so currently the biggest struggle the Netherlands is facing with is overpopulation, kind of similar to South Korea, I would say. Yeah, you see a lot here that people are struggling to find a house because the demand is just so high. And because of the high demand, also the house prices will increase. Actually, last week there was an article published that in the top 10 most expensive cities in Europe, Netherlands has 4 cities in that top 10, so that kind of shows on how expensive it is here. And yeah, through petitions, people are trying to find their voice to get some things changed.
Well, I see. Then where do most millennials and Gen Z in the Netherlands live at the moment? I mean, what type of housing contracts do they usually go for?
Yeah, at the moment it's mostly renting. Buying your house is very hard, especially with starting salaries. I myself am a student. I live in I think most typical student house you can imagine. It's the most thing we have here is living in rooms. It's not like South Korea where it's most students live in dorms. Usually it's led over by the market itself. We do have dorms, but that's mostly for international students. But for myself, like I live here with 3 other people. It's 16 square meters. We share a bathroom and the kitchen, and that's, I think, the most standard you can get here. But after your student life, when you want to get something on your own, you're still kind of stuck to renting, since getting a mortgage with starting salary would only give you about half the amount of money that would suffice to buy an average house. So you either start already with a lot of money to buy a house, or you're going to have to rent for a while.
You know, you explained perfectly some of the things that our generation goes through when we first have to go out and find housing. So are there some youth support policies in Netherlands as well? And if not, are you looking forward to some measures and support that might come into place in the future?
Yeah, there are a couple measures already being taken. One of them, for example, we have a housing subsidy if you're older than 23, so that's pretty much in the right age range. You have to not earn too much. The house has not to be of too high quality, but based on that, you can convert it to about 500,000 won per month for subsidy for your house. So that helps a lot. And I think for the problem the government is struggling most with is that they do realize, I think, that the housing problem is there, and they try to tackle it by building more houses, which seems like a fair point. but the houses that are being built are a bit too high quality, I think. By being high quality, they also become more expensive. And that doesn't really help out Gen Z to buy those houses because they're not even eligible or even can't even afford to buy that house in the first place. So for them, the market doesn't really change. And for now, the new houses that are being built are being built in a large amount, but just not the right houses, I think. So I think to get that changed, they should be more affordable.
That's a very interesting point because here in Korea too, amongst my friends, we always say there's so many apartments out there, but none of them seem to be affordable to me. And that also comes with South Korea having such a low birth rate. But it's quite interesting to hear that in the Netherlands too, though the government is trying to push out more demand and more supply, it's not really better accommodating to the demand. But thank you so much, Elliot. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
All right. And Yellow mentioned a lot of great points. He really nailed it in the sense that we're seeing the housing crisis not only here in South Korea, but in other parts of the world. And I think it shed light as to what different governments have to do to better understand what youth need and require. So why don't we come up with our own solutions and voice out what we need in terms of living in one of the most expensive cities in the world right now?
Sure. So I think just like Yella said, we have to face this, tackle this in a multifaceted manner. And really to address it for the younger generation, especially here in the country, we need to adopt, like I said, we have to approach it from various aspects. And the most important would be, like Yella mentioned, affordability, as well as the supply shortages, and also access to financing as well. And I believe that the three most crucial factors, including these, are to increase the supply of housing, especially in urban areas where there's high demand, and regulate speculation, which often drives up the prices, and improve access to financing by making it easier for young people to obtain mortgage loans with low interest rates. And just like Yella said, increase the supply, but make sure that they're affordable and not too high quality.
Affordable supply, because at the end of the day, all we need is a roof over our head at the moment. What about you, Cheska?
I really agree with Chihi in terms of like the importance of being able to finance. So definitely more, I guess, more structured finance for youth who might not have the enough, credibility or security to back it up. But another thing that I would also like to mention is probably priority housing for certain areas or certain people, because as I mentioned before, when you don't have enough to afford, you're more likely to choose an options that are affordable but not safe, and that can kickstart a lot of other social security problems in the long run. And another thing that I think might be interesting is actually increasing public transportation and making them more affordable, frequent, and maybe even including bike lanes.
Exactly.
And there actually have been studies where increase in public transportations or transportation in general actually can alleviate the density of certain areas and disperse it, because now you're able to live, let's say, half an hour away from your job, but still be able to bike and get there in 15 minutes.
Exactly, and we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing high-speed railways come about, and also with more remote working, I think the pressure to having to live near the capital has definitely been alleviated. But hopefully, we'll see more of a societal and infrastructure change in order for the housing crisis to be stymied. Now, in the meantime, we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Chiji.
Thank you.
And Cheska Dainong.
Pleasure's always mine. Thank you.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are News Generation.